So F1 2020 is finally here then. I've been playing it. I've played about 10 hours or so on the game, and this is going to be my review on said game. Now, you're seeing in front of you my very first laps on Silverstone. I have spent 10 hours on the game previous to these laps, but these are my very first laps on Silverstone. So just to let you know what you're seeing in front of your eyes. Now, what is this review going to contain? Well, first up, I'm just going to have a general review of the game. So my thoughts on it, just really general overview of how the game feels, how it handles, and what I think of it. Next up, I'm going to tell you what my perceived changes are over 2019, so F1 2019 versus F1 2020, how I feel that it's changed. And then finally, we're going to hear from David Greca, who is the Chief Handling Designer, is probably something like his job title, for the F1 series. And he's going to be telling us exactly what has changed year on year. So F1 2019 versus F1 2020 again. And we're going to be running a few tests as well in amongst all that, just to see exactly the changes that he is talking about. So, well, let's get straight into it then. The question that everybody's going to be asking, is it a sim or is it an arcade? Now, I don't like this question at all because really, there's so much more in between. There isn't just two categories of games. There's all this space in between. And F1 should be an accessible and fun to drive game. Realistically, most F1 fans are not sim racers. They haven't got a full-on rig. They haven't got a £2,000 direct drive steering wheel. So this game needs to be accessible. But also, it does need to be realistic because obviously you don't want the real die-hard fans or even the sim racers to jump in and go, this game's rubbish. So F1 kind of sits in a weird middle ground, and to be honest, I think they absolutely nail it this year. They absolutely nail sitting in that really nice middle ground. It does have two modes though, so it does have a more casual mode this year. That's brand new this year. It has a more casual handling mode, which will be a bit more forgiving for the more casual players, but I'm not going to concentrate on that in this review because this review is more aimed, I think realistically, if you are watching a handling review, probably you are a bit more on the sort of sim sort of end of things. But if you're not, then it does have that separate mode for you, which will just make it a little bit more accessible for you to drive. How does it feel then? How does F1 2020 feel to drive? It feels incredible. F1 2020 really is very, very good. It feels amazing. It feels by far the best F1 game to date. There is no F1 game that I can recall that's felt better. Of course, at the time, games feel great. You go back and play them now, and they're actually quite terrible by today's standards. But even on perception of what they were like at the time, this one is way, way better. I've been blown away, and actually, I first played this game maybe a month ago or so. I got access to the F1 beta, and the minute I played it, the beta had a couple of issues that I wanted resolved, which have been. But the minute I played it, I said, I'm not going back to F1 2019. I can't. This new game is so good, and this is how it should be, and they've really nailed it that I cannot go back to F1 2019 now in good conscience and enjoy it. So that's just how good it is. That's, a huge compliment, and an even bigger compliment, in my opinion, is that this game just feels natural. It just feels right. And I think that was a big problem with last year's game is you had to know how to specifically drive that game to be fast. You had to know what the car was going to do before it was going to do it. You had to know the characteristics of the game to know, where you had to be gentle, when you had to be aggressive. But this game, it gets rid of all that. This game is just good. It just feels right. I think pretty much anyone can just jump in and play it. Whether you're a casual player, it's nice and accessible, or whether you're a sim racer and you've raced 20 other racing titles and you've got a full-on rig setup, I believe that anyone can just jump in this game and just enjoy it and just get along with it. I'll give you a good example of my flatmate. He, a couple of months ago, he tried F1 2019 for the first time and just couldn't get along with it. He's got a nice Fanatec wheel, he's got a nice screen, decent gaming computer. He just couldn't get along with it. It took him, probably 50 laps just to be able to get round at somewhat of decent pace. And he, he used to be a league racer. He's a decent racer, but he just could not get along with it. And that just tells you where 2019 was at. And 2020 is completely different to that. And to me, that is a big compliment. To say that a game just feels natural, it feels right. There's of course a million different things that feed into that feeling. But to say that it just feels amazing is such a huge, huge compliment. And this game really does nail that feeling. It's so fun to drive, and it really is a huge improvement over the previous game. Now, if I'm going to be picky and pick out some negatives, for this review to effectively force some negatives, because to be honest, I love this game. I love how it feels, and I didn't want to say anything negative at all, because I didn't want to bring it down. But if I'm going to be really, really picky and try and find some negatives in the interest of balance, then I will say it is a little bit understeery. You know, the turn-in isn't quite as instant as you'd find on a sim like iRacing, and there is a bit of mid-corner understeer, but that is to be expected. You know, I started this video by saying does need to be accessible to the casual player. You know, it needs to be usable on a pad. It can't be the most, you know, front-end focused bitey game in the world. It does need a little bit of understeer just to make it accessible. So, and it is minor. You know, I am talking minor, and realistically, if you really care about the balance of a car that much, you could just do a couple of setup changes, put on a bit more front wing, maybe change the toe a little bit, change the diff a little bit. You know, you can work your way around that. So that's not, you know, that is a minor issue with the not an issue with the handling. That's overstating it. It is an element of the handling which some people might not like, but I don't believe that's really an issue in itself. Another very picky negative is that there isn't much bite at low speed. So the Codemasters games have always struggled with the bite at low speed. It just doesn't feel right when you're going really slow in a, you know, say Monza turn 1 in a really tight chicane. It just doesn't bite as well as you'd like it to, and something that iRacing I think gets this quite right, because they've got a very, very advanced tyre model, but it just doesn't bite perfectly. But I think it is balanced. It is really nicely balanced at low speed. You know, you can get it through the corners nicely, and again, it just feels natural, but it doesn't really bite into the track. It still feels like it's very slightly floating over the track, but again, that is being quite picky. It does still feel good at low speed. And one other minor, I would say it's more of a bug than really an issue with the handling, is that for some reason the inside tyre will continue to lock after you get off the brakes sometimes. Now, I've only noticed this on particularly cambered corners. You know, Monaco is a great example of that, and you know, you lock up the inside wheel a little bit, you come off the brakes to stop it locking, and it just stays locked for a little bit longer. To be honest, that might be an animation issue. It might be that the wheel starts rotating again a little bit, but because the wheel's effectively off the ground, it just still smokes. It could be purely a visual issue rather than a handling issue. But it doesn't affect the feel of the car at all, so the feel of the car is exactly the same. It still feels right, but that is, you know, potentially a sign of some sort of issue within the handling, or as I said, it could be purely visual, it could be purely aesthetic and purely an animation thing. So take that one with a big pinch of salt. But that is the only negatives that I could come up with for the handling for this game. And as I said, I've played 10 hours on this game. I played probably another 5 hours or so on the beta. So, you know, 15 hours is a decent chunk of time, and after all that time, that's all the negatives I can come up with, because it really, really is good. Moving on now then to my F1 2019 comparison, and also my perceived feelings of the differences to the game. So we're going to have F1 2019 on the left, which is going to be my very first hot lap after playing F1 2020. So we should see a direct difference between the way that I try and treat the two. And on the right, we have just got F1 2020, which is my best lap that I did across maybe 10 or 20 laps or so. So straight away on the exit then, they will be lined up more or less as we come to the start-finish line. Of course, the one on the right will be a bit quicker, just because cars do get quicker year on year. And you see straight away there, F1 2019 having to correct oversteer in 8th gear, going completely flat, which just isn't right. Here we see they're more or less level, but look at F1 2020 on the right, just having so much more grip, so much more confidence on the traction. F1 2019 on the left is just struggling, bit of oversteer, bit of wheel spin, and F1 2020 on the right, you can see it's already quite a bit ahead. Coming into the next section then, again, just more confidence. You see there, just one nice smooth arc of emotion on the 2020 game, and on F1 2019 on the left, really just having to seesaw away at the wheel. A little bit of oversteer on the exit there, but that was just really getting on the power. And you can be so much more aggressive on the power in F1 2020. And there we go, look at that again, F1 2019 just sliding all over the place. And those are the two key differences. There's more traction in F1 2020, and it's a lot more stable at high speed. It's got more downforce and it's more stable, so it just feels night and day. And to me, that is by far the biggest difference in the game, is the high speed. I never liked F1 2019 in high speed. It was always far too oversteery, and F1 2020 has completely fixed that, and they've given it more traction, so it just feels better on the exits. I will say as well that the force feedback is better on F1 2020. There has been definitely improvement there. The tyres seem to hold the dirt a little bit longer, so if you go off the track, the tyres just grab onto that a bit longer, and there is less rotation when you change down the gears, so it's not so beneficial anymore to really just change down the gears to try and get the car to twist around the corners. Moving on now to the final segment of my F1 2020 handling review, and we are going to be sort of hearing from David Greco. So I've been speaking with David Greco on Twitter in the DMs. As I mentioned previously, he is the chief handling designer for F1 2020. So he is the guy that really just, looks after the handling, designs it, changes it the way he sees fit. So I spoke directly to him to try and figure out exactly what has changed, and he sent me a really helpful list. So first on that list is that he says there's completely new wheel inertia and weight calculations to help with traction and lockups. Now, this is something that they actually talked about a little bit in the build-up to the game when they were trying to hype it up a little. Lee Mather, the chief game designer, spoke about it himself, and this seems to be quite a new way of working. It's hard to obviously get a grasp on exactly what's changed, but it seems to be that the way that the wheel inertia, so the momentum of the turning of the wheel, the way that worked before seemed to be a little bit odd, which is probably why the traction was quite tricky before, and that sounds like it's been completely overhauled, which is probably why we're seeing a lot more traction on the exits of corners, and probably also contributes, I imagine, towards the force feedback just feeling a lot better, a lot more like it's got a lot more sort of bite, a lot more feeling to it. Second up then, we have got improved rebalance and increased the downforce in general. So we picked up on that in the higher speed. I think though, obviously there is a bit more downforce this year. They've just added a bit more, probably to take it more in line with the real cars. But I think the key thing for me here is the rebalanced downforce, improved and rebalanced. As I said previously, before it was far too oversteery at high speed. It was awful, to be honest. So the fact that that's now completely gone, just adding more downforce won't have fixed that. The rebalance and the improvement probably is what's helped that high speed. And again, that is a really, really big change. Those two changes, I think, for me, are the biggest ones that you'll feel in this game. Next up then, we've got reworked engine inertia, engine braking torque, and engine braking map in order to create a smoother experience while changing gears and prevent the rear axle from locking in order to stop the abuse of low gears to rotate the car. So this is something that JD is known for, isn't he? TRL Limitless. He's known for changing down gears and trying to really rotate the car through corners. And, everyone needs a bit of car rotation. I used to do this back in my league racing days, back in F1 2013. Shift down the gears as early as possible to really get the car to rotate around the corner. Now, obviously, it still exists. Obviously, the more you shift down, the more engine braking you get, so the more the car's going to rotate. That's just physics. That is going to happen. But before it was just too extreme. So the differences would be too stark. Also the differences between the gears. So when you actually change gear, it was a bit more brutal before, so that the car would really rotate as it shifted, as it really sort of grabbed those higher revs. So that whole effect has just been hugely reduced in this game, and it does show. It does show in the feeling of the handling. You don't feel a need to really downshift because it doesn't do as much. It does help a little bit, but actually, should you be in first gear in what would be a third or fourth gear corner? You shouldn't, and it just feels wrong. You're over revving the engine, and it just creates a bit too much instability. So this has been, obviously it's still a thing, but it's been reduced hugely, and it sounds like it's been quite a big rework of how the engine works and how much inertia the engine has in itself. So that's quite a big change, and I think does contribute quite heavily to this sort of less aggressive, or the more aggressive driving that we see on F1 esports drivers doing. I believe we'll see a lot less of that now and a lot less aggressive use of the gears. Next up then, we've got improved suspension geometry, mainly toe, to help with traction and make the car more sensitive to setup changes. So mainly toe, this is just going to help a little bit. This again is probably more to the feel. It probably helps the force feedback that I felt. Also probably helps with some traction. Well, he says that it does need to help with traction. So that was what I felt, the better traction. More sensitive to setup changes. To be honest, I've been using default setups. I've not even played with a setup yet, but it's good to see that a bit more sensitive to setup changes. I'm sure the more sim racers amongst you will enjoy that. Next up, which is actually quite a big change for me, we've got dynamic tyre pressure that will dynamically affect grip, ability to absorb bumps and curbs, tyre wear, tyre temperature, and tyre rolling resistance. So, having spoken to David, it sounds like that the tyre pressure was actually just a constant before in previous F1 games. So the tyre pressure would be exactly what you set it in the setup in the pits, and it remained the same throughout the whole stint, no matter how worn the tyres were, no matter how hot the tyres were, no matter how much load you're putting under them, which obviously isn't realistic. The hotter a car gets, the more that the tyre pressures increase, and also obviously with load, the tyre pressures increase as you put in what F1 car's got 1,000 kilos of downforce on the car. Of course the tyre pressure is going to increase. So that's an interesting change, and I imagine that is actually probably under the skin quite a big change. It's not something that you'll necessarily feel, but I imagine that just feeds into the car just feeling really natural rather than just being this weird static element to it. It's now dynamic. So again, probably quite a big change under the skin. but in terms of feel, it probably does make a big difference, but you can't feel it individually as such. Next up then, we've got added pneumatic trail calculations in the force feedback system, which helps the feel of the car under braking, acceleration, longitudinal forces. Now, I don't really know what that means. I'm sure most of you don't either. But I mean, the key thing there is the longitudinal forces there. So it just helps the car feel a bit better under braking and acceleration. Don't really know what added pneumatic trail calculations to the force feedback system really means, but it sounds like it's a good change. So it clearly felt need to mention it there. So it probably does actually affect the feel of the car. Next up, we got fixed a few mistakes in calculation of the diff. So again, this is probably something that just changes the amount of oversteer that you get in the high speed, I would say. It sounds like quite a minor change, just a few little mistakes. So it's just a few very minor changes in how the diff feels. Next up, we got reworked engine power output in order to avoid as much as possible the use of a gear past 12,000 RPM. So, you know, I think that one really just says itself. I think before you could rev the engine out a little bit, which is unrealistic. You know, F1 cars do lose power when you go above 12,000 RPM. That's just the way that the fuel, the amount of fuel they're allowed to put in the engine, that's the way that it works, the way the rules work. So the fact that that's now different, it probably just a bit more realistic. Just stop people being able to rev the engine quite so much and gaining time from doing so. Next up, we've got improved gearing ratio. Again, quite a minor one. He felt I need to mention it, but the gearings will have just changed a little bit. I've noticed that the lower gears are a little bit shorter, so maybe that's feeding into it. But again, quite a minor one really, but just thought I'd throw in that as he's mentioned it. And lastly then, we have got the ERS system. I've put this last because although this is a big change, the ERS is quite different this year. It does change quite differently how the races go and how you manage the car. It is a big change, but actually, is it handling? Kind of. Obviously the ERS does affect the traction, but I decided this wasn't really part of handling, which is why I've excluded it almost entirely from this review. But I will mention it in some other videos because the ERS system has changed a lot, but whether it's handling, I've decided to exclude it myself. That's it then. That about sums up my feelings and my research that I've done on F1 2020 handling. Just to recap, it's incredible. It feels really, really good. It's by far the best F1 game yet. If you've bought any of the last 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 F1 games and you quite like them, but maybe you don't want to buy each game each year, this is the game you need to buy. There's lots of other changes as well. I have another video coming soon on the actual changes between F1 2019 and F1 2020. But purely in terms of handling, it's by far the best game yet. You need to try it. It just feels amazing. It's really fun to drive. You can really push. And for me, last year, I just didn't enjoy it. I never really enjoyed driving the cars. I still spent best part of 100 hours on the game, but I just never got along with the handling. This feels amazing. It's so natural. It's so nice. You have to try it. For what it's trying to do, this game really, really hits the nail on the head, and it's incredible. Please do try F1 2020 handling. It really is very, very good.